So today we'll be covering our recommendations for refreshing your database as you prepare for the new year. We'll be going through a list of tips and tricks that we recommend at least considering on an annual basis to help you keep your database in top shape. Now, for some people, that makes a lot of sense in the new calendar year. For others, it's more prudent to do these things during perhaps a slow period or maybe at the start of your fiscal year. So if you need to come back to this recording when that's appropriate for your organization, obviously feel free to do that. As always, it'll be made available on our YouTube channel. So to start, we will look at your volunteer application and volunteer profile information, kind of the data collection aspect. And then we'll move into some general database cleanup for volunteers, groups, and opportunities. And then finally, we'll discuss some options for visually updating your console to match your website better. So the end of the year is really a good time to evaluate the information on your volunteer application. That can include adding or removing information, changing the wording or the ordering of the questions, and also perhaps updating your terms and conditions. As a reminder, in case you weren't aware, Service only requires that you collect last name, first name, primary phone, and email in order for volunteers to make their own accounts. Everything else on your application, the order of these questions, and some of the wording is entirely up to you. So if you've always wondered, why are we collecting this piece of information, or why aren't we collecting this piece of information? There's probably some choices that were made that went into that, but generally speaking, all of that kind of stuff is up to you. So under the System Management heading, if we go into Edit System Configuration, there's two sections that have to do with data collection, information collection, and custom volunteer profile fields. If we look in the information collection section, these contain a lot of pretty standard pieces of info you might expect to see on an application like this, like volunteer address or gender, birth date, things like that, t-shirt size. So of course you can go through here and toggle things on and off. And then if we jump down to the custom fields, this also includes the option to add custom questions to your general application. So again, it's just a good time to consider, what data are we collecting? Why are we collecting this information? If you'd like to review your application as it's viewed by volunteers, you can always use this console navigation tab at the top of the page and select your volunteer application. Just be aware, clicking this here will log you out and take you to the application page. So a lot of times I actually recommend opening that in a different browser or perhaps an incognito window, just so you're not constantly logging in and out. But it's just a good idea to get your eyes on what data are we collecting, how is it formatted, do I want to change any of the language in here, and then also things like your terms and conditions. So let's talk about making some of those changes. Now, obviously I showed that in your system configuration, you can update what fields are on or off. Some of those let you pick whether they're required or optional. But I also want to point out, you can reorder the fields on the application. So at the top of the information collection section, if you click on Reorder Volunteer Profile Fields, it also says Configure Quick Reg, which is like a truncated version of your application page. But if you click on that button, it takes us to a separate page. From here, you can drag and drop to move questions around. So by default, Service puts last name at the top of the application. Maybe you want to flip that, put first name at the top. You can just drag and drop to move those things around. This shows all the possible questions on the application, so that'll include any unused custom fields or things you have disabled, so you can generally ignore those things. But anything you want to move around, perhaps shuffling things to be near one another if you've made some custom questions that have to do with each other, this is where you can make those changes by just dragging and dropping to move things around. I also want to point out there are some things in here volunteers don't see, like their access level or their start date or notes or tags on their account. These are, of course, things you can see on volunteer accounts, and you can still move them around. Maybe you want to view them in different places, because when you're looking at a volunteer account, the system will also use this order that you've set up in here. And then lastly on this page, the rightmost icon, this checkbox, is whether or not to include a question in your QuickReg application. The QuickReg application, again, is just a truncated version of your full application, which you can deploy in certain circumstances where you want to collect less information. Now remember, once you've made changes on this page, down at the bottom, click Save Order. That will publish those changes and kind of immediately change both the application page and also when you are creating a new account and also when you are managing volunteer profiles. So if you go in to review someone's account, it'll take into account the order that you have specified in the system configuration. One final thing kind of in this vein is your terms and conditions or liability waiver. How are we collecting signatures from volunteers? We do have an entire webinar on this subject specifically. So if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you there. You can search for this webinar, or if you click into videos, you'll see these sorted by kind of the order they were added. But we have a webinar in here about collecting terms and conditions, or how do we collect a signature from volunteers. So if you want a more in-depth look at what these are, how they function, how they're presented to volunteers, I'd recommend engaging this. But just in brief, it is usually a good idea to make sure that your terms kind of align with how you want to communicate with volunteers, and you can do that in the system configuration. So you can update your terms through here. If you do make any changes to your terms and conditions, whether that's the intro text or the body of the terms themselves, if you publish those changes, Service will treat that as a new set of terms and conditions. So when a volunteer updates their profile, they will be asked to re-sign these terms. So if you make changes to your terms and conditions, and you want to force people to update their profiles, which this is also a very common thing to do at the end of the year or just kind of to refresh your database, you can require volunteers to verify their account information. So under volunteer management, if we go into search and manage the volunteer database, if we leave the search bar blank and click search volunteer database, we can see everyone in the system. We can select everyone in the system using the checkbox in the heading. And then in the drop-down menu, we can do a bulk update. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things you can bulk update. In this case, we don't really want to change everything on people's accounts. What we want to do is require verification. So down at the bottom, there's an option that says require verification of volunteer profile information, which does exactly what it sounds like. If we select this to bulk update and set yes here, that's really the only option. What this will do is when the volunteer next logs in. So if we bulk update our database here, now the next time any person logs into their account, they will be required to look over their profile, make sure all the application questions are answered and hopefully correct. You know, maybe if they've moved, they might update that address field. And then it'll also require that they re-sign your terms if you've made a new set of terms, like I mentioned, just by making a change to what your terms say, or if you've made changes in general to, you know, what they're actually agreeing to, or if it's been more than a year since they last signed them. So whether or not you do make changes to your application, whether or not you do make changes to your terms and conditions, I would certainly consider pushing that require verification on an annual basis, because you're just making sure that volunteers update their info. You know, if someone is consistently working with you, but they've moved or they've changed phone numbers, well, we want to know that. So if we require verification, really what that does is the next time somebody logs in, it will present them with their application. And if there's any gaps in the profile, they'll have to fill it in. And then, of course, hopefully they would update things if they're incorrect. All right. Apart from that, there's just a few other things I want to point out, specifically as it relates to capturing signatures or documents from volunteers. If we go back into the system configuration, back into information collection, there is something here called the liability waiver or medical release. Now this can be retitled if you want to change its name to something else, but this is asking volunteers to physically sign a document. Again, I would refer to that webinar on terms and conditions for more information about this. But if you need to collect a signature, actual pen to paper from volunteers, this is one way to handle that. Or you can push documents to volunteers by uploading them to your system. There's a section under System Management for File Management. And in here, you can upload documents and you can post these so that volunteers will see them in a section on their profile. And you can even allow volunteers to upload documents to their own account. There's an option here for volunteers to upload file attachments. If you don't see this when you are kind of engaging from the volunteer perspective, or if you have a test account, something like that, there's a setting in the system configuration under security and privacy that says whether or not you allow file attachment uploads. So if you need to receive documents from volunteers, this is also something good to consider turning on. And then just one final note with that, you can also receive notifications if you would like to. So if I want to get emailed every time someone uploads an attachment, I can put my name in here. I'll get an email every time a volunteer does that. Alternatively, you can use the advanced volunteer search to find volunteers who have uploaded attachments to their profile. So there's a section for volunteer file attachments, and we can say, show me attachments that were added, or rather accounts that had an attachment added, within this date range. Okay, so that's a little bit more to do with kind of collecting signatures and requesting documents from volunteers. Again, if you have more questions about that topic as a whole, I would refer to that webinar on terms and conditions. Of course, please feel free to ask questions away. All right, next we're going to talk about kind of managing your databases, sort of updating the volunteer database, your groups database, the opportunity database, just to kind of refresh things as we head into each new year. So let's start off in the volunteer side of things. If we go into search and manage the volunteer database, one thing you may notice as you're looking at accounts is that you might have some people that are marked as inactive, or by default they are marked as active. So you'll see sort of blue icons here. That marker is something that someone has done in the past. So Service will not automatically mark active accounts as inactive. Conversely, it will also not automatically mark inactive accounts as active. This is something that you can designate. Now, the default stance of the system is a setting. You can have the system mark volunteers as active by default. That is kind of the normal scenario, and your system will be doing that unless you or someone on staff has changed that. But you could have Service mark people as inactive by default. Just kind of depends on your workflow. But at the end of the year or once a season, it's a good idea to kind of assess who are my active volunteers and who are my inactive volunteers. And we can do that in a few different ways. This is really sort of a moving target depending on your organization, kind of what you would consider regular volunteer engagement, when you would consider someone as being an inactive volunteer or no longer engaging with you. So what we'll need to do is run a search based on whatever your criteria is. And the way we do this is with the advanced volunteer search. We can do that on this page. We can click into advanced search, or from the main dashboard, go straight into advanced volunteer search. Both of those things will take us to this page. And of course, this searching page has a whole slew of options. What are usually used to identify inactive or active volunteers are things like volunteer activity. Have they logged into their account? Have they registered for events? Or volunteer participation. So there's a few searches I want to draw your attention to. Under this first heading, Service Account Status Options, if we click on that, we can expand it. And in here, there are a couple searches to pay attention to. First of all, we may not use this in this context, but I want to point it out. You can find volunteers with a start date between certain dates, or who've had an account for X number of years, or their start date falls between certain dates if you're looking for anniversaries. Sometimes this type of search is used in order to identify like how old an account is in conjunction with how much they've done, that sort of thing. So I do want to point that out. But in this section, there is also a search to find volunteers that have not had any account activity for more than X number of months. This is a pretty good baseline, usually. Not always, but usually. So what this will show you is, for example, if I choose 12 months here, I will see all volunteers who haven't done anything in 12 months. They haven't logged in or updated their profile. They haven't logged in and signed up for an opportunity. They haven't really engaged the platform in more than this many months, right? Now, I could add in some other searches here. Perhaps I also want to say, okay, show me these people who haven't done anything in the last 12 months, and also they are currently marked as active, right? Kind of unnecessary if you're just going to be bulk marking all these people as inactive, because it's not going to like duplicate that data. But maybe you just want to know that for your own numbers, and I think that's a prudent thing to do. We can say, okay, show me only the people that I haven't marked as inactive already, so they're still active, but they haven't done anything in the last 12 months. Right? So this is one way to run this search. Now, this is just people, who haven't logged in or signed up for events, so it's a little bit more broad. Maybe you care to mark people as active versus inactive based on whether or not they actually participated or are signed up for anything. In that case, we can use participation options. If we scroll down a bit in this page, we have volunteer participation options, and we can say, show me volunteers or find volunteers that have more than, exactly, less than, or between a certain number of times or hours served, or other impact tracking metrics as well. Very commonly, I see this done as exactly 0 times, and then maybe between certain dates. Perhaps I want to look at January 1st of this year, through today, but actually usually I would forecast this just in case they're signed up for something upcoming. So this type of search is finding people with 0 registrations. This isn't always what you might want to do exactly, because let's say someone made a new account yesterday and they haven't yet signed up for something. Well, I don't necessarily want to call that person inactive. So what we might also do, if we scroll back up, is use that search I mentioned before. Find volunteers with a start date between certain dates. So maybe as long as they made their account before January 1st of this year. So if they made their account sometime before January 1st of 2025, so I'll push this start date back really far. So their account can be really, really old, but they don't have any registrations. So it's kind of another way to find inactive volunteers. And again, the point of adding in this secondary portion, if someone just made a profile this year or this month, maybe I want to say like since June of this month or since July of this year, so if someone made an account starting in July, there's a little bit of a grace period. I'm not going to mark them as inactive yet, but if they're not signed up for anything next year, obviously then I would, right? So this is basically showing me everyone who made an account June or earlier, and they have no registrations on their account between January of this year and looking into next year. So I'm capturing if they've, signed up for something in the future. So this type of search, again, I'm just trying to identify inactive volunteers. Once I do that, we can select those volunteers, use the bulk actions here, do another bulk update. So like requiring verification, go in and bulk update these accounts. And then there's a couple things we could bulk update. Generally speaking, in this case, we want to do the volunteer status. There is also a volunteer account status. I'll show you this, but I wouldn't do this update in this scenario. So if we go ahead and do a bulk update, it'll say for volunteer status, we have active or inactive. And obviously the whole point of this was to mark inactive volunteers. And then account status has a couple options, unlocked, locked, and disabled. I just want to kind of point these out and make sure you know what these mean. Normally, volunteers will float between locked and unlocked. Normally, people are unlocked. If they use the wrong password too many times, they will be locked. And the system does that automatically. And they can unlock their account by requesting a new temporary password, gets sent to their email, kind of verifies they're the owner of that email, right? So this is sort of normal, unlocked or locked. If you need to fire a volunteer or bar someone from the system, you can disable their profile. This, from the volunteer's perspective, permanently locks them out. They cannot undo this. Now, again, normally if I'm just marking inactive volunteers, I'm not doing that. I'm not marking people as disabled because if this person comes back, I want them to be able to re-engage the platform. I would only really disable an account if, again, it's a scenario where I need to bar them from the system. Okay, so that was the idea of, again, searching for and identifying inactive volunteers and then bulk updating them to mark them as inactive. But we would also want to do the flip side of that. Maybe you had someone that you had marked as inactive in the past, but they did come back this year, right? So I could go into the advanced search and do kind of the exact opposite of what we just looked at. Show me inactive volunteers who, and in this case, I would use either participation. I think that's kind of the best metric for this. So find volunteers with more than 0 time served this year. Right? So go and find someone who is marked as inactive currently, but they have actually signed up for something. And again, I would forecast this a little bit just in case they're signed up for something in the new year. But I would keep sort of a similar scheme here. So like always start with the start of the year or the start of your fiscal year. That way, when you repeat this process in the following year, you're kind of, pigtailing off of what you did previously. So this type of search, again, we're looking for people who have been marked as inactive, but they did actually come back. We would take these accounts, do a bulk update, and mark them as active. So both of those things are things that I would do in the volunteer database. There's one final thing that I would do in the volunteer database on an annual basis, and that's just to check who has high levels of access that maybe shouldn't. Right? There's always scenarios where there's change of personnel. So if we go into the advanced search under account status options, we can search by what access level someone has. The main ones here I'd be concerned about are admin and leadership team. Event and group leader are pretty low levels in terms of what they're allowed to do, but if you want to check those, of course you can. But if we search for people who have admin and leadership team, incidentally, if you hold control, you can select multiple items here. If we click on search volunteer database, we can see all of the people who have those levels of access. And I would just quickly get your eyes on this. If you see any staff members here who have moved on, are no longer working with you, I would make sure to go in and update their profile and change their access level back down to volunteer. It's just best practice not to allow too many accounts with this high level of access. And especially if they're no longer working with you, you want to reduce that down. You don't necessarily need to do anything else with these profiles. If you update someone's account back down to volunteer access, that just instantly truncates what they're allowed to do. And you don't necessarily need to go and flip everything from that person to other people, especially if it was in the past. Now we're going to look at the opportunity database in a little bit here. And if you have events upcoming that, the point of contact is incorrect, of course, we'll want to change that. But I wouldn't necessarily worry about backlogging a million changes to an admin that's moved on because, there's actually some value in having that historic data, like who was in charge of this event. And it's just, kind of tedious work that you don't necessarily need to do. I would be more concerned about what's upcoming, what's ongoing, than what has already happened. Okay, so those are kind of the changes I would make on the volunteer side. Searching for and marking active versus inactive volunteers, and then also searching for and identifying access levels and possibly people we need to flip out of different access levels. In the group management side of the database, what I would do for cleanup here is pretty straightforward, but it's also kind of similar to what we just talked about. One thing, if you have not already used tags to categorize groups, this can be a larger task depending on how many groups you have in your database. But this can be a helpful thing to do. If you have like a set of groups, sometimes you might have used like the name to identify that set, but you can also do bulk updates in here and we can add tags. So maybe I want to go in and tag all of these as being a bank And in particular, they're all community banks. So maybe I'll just create a tag for that specifically. Maybe they're a corporate sponsor. I can add all these tags in. That way in the future, if I want to run searches for, a set of groups based on a particular, marker or moniker, I don't have to rely on it being in the name. I can run a search for like all of my banks that have been tagged, or all of my schools that have been tagged, or all of my corporate partners or whatever else, right? You can add tags in to identify sets of groups. So if you haven't been doing that kind of work, then this can be a little bit to kind of kickstart. But if you have some time to work through that, that can help you run searches for like sets of groups at a time. The other thing that you can do through here, just like on the volunteer side, is mark active versus inactive. So if you're looking through this list and you're thinking, oh, we don't work with this organization anymore, you can go in and manage the group or go straight into update the group, and you can change its status from active to inactive. You can add some notes in there. But again, same kind of idea. You're just kind of tracking, who am I still working with? Who am I not working with? Okay, so that's kind of the group management side of things. The last big portion of the database where you might want to make some changes kind of on an annual basis is the opportunity side. And there's a few things that I would do in here to just run checks in terms of, are things up to date? First of all, so like we just talked about earlier, you might have had some staffing changes. You can go through and search for opportunities that have a particular person as an organizer. Right. So if somebody has moved on and you want to change those events to be, pointed to a different person, you can search for events by organizer. Now, this search in here by default will show you all the events with that organizer. You can do an advanced search to say, only show me the open events that have that person as an organizer. So that's also an option. That way you're not, again, backlogging that data. So I just clicked into advanced search here under advanced options. But yeah, you can search for events based on who the organizer is. And just like on the volunteer side, just like on the group side, you can make bulk changes. Now I only have one event that's popping up here, so I would just update this manually. But if I had multiple events, I could select them all, use the drop down here, say bulk update, and then I'll tell it what I want to update, which would be the organizer. So that's one thing to do with, again, I would be concerned with ongoing or upcoming opportunities, not so much with closed opportunities, but just making sure you have the correct point of contact. Also, in case you didn't know it, as you are looking at this page, as you're glancing through it, if you mouse over this kind of person icon, that will tell you who the organizer is. So if you just want to glance at a particular event without clicking into edit it, you can do that by mousing over this icon. That will show you both the primary and the secondary organizers for that opportunity. Other things you might want to do on this page are marking no-shows. If you haven't been doing this throughout the year, you will want to do this before you run reports. By default, Service assumes that volunteers attended a shift for its full duration. So if you do not mark no-shows, then anyone who was registered for the event will receive credit for the event. Now, if a volunteer cancels their registration, or if you remove a volunteer manually, that would also remove the volunteer from the event. They will not get credit. But if you have left a volunteer registered for an event, now in this case, we're talking more about closed opportunities. So if, we have this event here with 10 out of 10 registrations, if I go in to view the registered volunteers and I realize, this person wasn't there, I can do one of two things. I can remove them from the event, or I can mark them as a no-show. And that is important to do, again, because otherwise the system will give them credit for that event, and that will skew both your reports and their reports. So marking a no-show will do two things. It removes that person from the event. It also adds a no-show note to their profile, which is something that you can search by. In the advanced volunteer search, you can find volunteers based on how many no-shows they've had within a given time frame. There is another tool to help with no-shows. If you are using the sign-in console, then you can select multiple events, or maybe just one or two, depending on what you're trying to do. But you can select multiple events here, and in the drop-down menu, you can say Mark No-Shows. So this is a bulk action. It does not automatically or immediately mark no-shows. What it does is it pulls a list of all of the people who did not sign in for a shift that has already occurred. So again, if you're using the sign-in console, this is an excellent tool. It basically just rounds up all the people who might be no-shows based on the fact that they didn't sign in, and then you can still manually vet this. You can look through and say, actually, I remember Sean was there. I'm going to go ahead and sign him in just to get him off of this list, but everybody else we're going to mark as a no-show, right? So it's just going to pull you that list. If you are not using the sign-in console, this will show you everyone, right? Because nobody signed in. So this is a little bit more valuable if you are using the sign-in console. And if you are using the sign-in console and you're not already using this tool, I would encourage you to do this on a daily or weekly basis. It obviously is a lot easier to look back at the last week or the last day than the last year. Okay, so that's one other thing I would do on the opportunity side. The last thing would be to kind of clean up the events themselves, right? Throughout the year, a lot of times we might make duplicates that we don't necessarily need anymore. We might think, this event should actually be connected to this event. So there's different things you can do to engage with the events themselves. First of all, if you have any duplicated events that you haven't actually engaged with or you're not planning on using, you can always just delete those, right? Whenever you make a copy of an event, the system will put the word copy in the title and it will open the event. So these will kind of persist in this view unless you do something with it. So if you have any copies sitting around like this with no registrations and you're not planning on using it, I would just freely delete these. You can do that in bulk, but I would just go in and select the event down at the bottom, click on delete opportunity. It'll say, are you sure you want to do this? You can click yes, proceed with delete. The system will not let you delete events that have registrations. So if I accidentally clicked on the original version of that event, not the copy, when I click delete here, it will say, hey, you can't do that. There are people registered for this event. So that's just something that is a little bit of a safety net. If you wanted to delete it, let's say the event didn't happen, you can still remove everyone from the event and then delete it. That is always an option, but you can't just do it accidentally right off the bat. So again, any open copies, if you have any copies sitting around, you could of course search for them by name, search by the word copy in the opportunity name, unless of course you have events that legitimately have that word in it. But that can kind of pull those up and you can of course remove those. Another tool that was added this year is merging opportunities. So if you have multiple versions of an event that you previously kept as separate normal events, but you realize, it's a pretty regular basis, I should just merge these into one time slot event, you can do that now. We're not going to walk through the merge tool top to bottom today. That would take a little bit too much time for what we have. So I will point you towards our webinar on that topic. But I just want to point out, if you select multiple events in here, there's a drop-down menu option for merging opportunities, and you can use that to kind of pull the information together. There's another screen that says, okay, how do we want to merge these? Do we want to make a new event based on those two and just add them in as time slots? Or do we want to merge them all into one event? You will be combining the registrations. That's kind of the point of this. You keep all that data. So before you take this action, it'd be prudent to learn what all of these different options mean. So again, I would refer you to our webinar on merging opportunities, which we did a couple months ago, that really walks through this feature top to bottom. How do we use it? What are the use cases for this? Why does this exist? Okay, so that is kind of the opportunity management side of things and what I would do in that part of the dashboard. The last thing to think about as you're thinking about refreshing your database for the new day is just kind of the general look and feel of your console. There are a lot of options in Service to change the way that the system appears to volunteers, both in terms of just general looks and colors and logos and things like that, and also what you're communicating with volunteers. A lot of this is primarily in the system configuration. So if we go back in there, there's a couple sections I would want to point out. We've talked a couple times now about staff changes. One thing you'll want to check is under organization information, you have your primary organization contact info here. So just making sure that this is up to date is a good thing to do. Other than that, generally speaking, I would check out page content. This is one place where there's a lot of communication with volunteers. For example, you have things like your event listing page welcome message. This is just a blurb at the top of the event listing page. If you've never looked at this before, now is a good time to do it. If you click on this preview icon, it will show you what that looks like in situ. But this is basically just a welcome message at the top of that page that everyone will see as kind of the first thing when they're looking at your events. Definitely something worth your eyes. So page content has a lot of sections like that. And then email message content, same sort of concept. There's a lot of emails that Service is sending based on registrations or reminders. And all of those emails can be kind of fabricated or updated in here. So just making sure that this aligns with how you want to communicate is definitely worthwhile. And then one more section in here called System Appearance. Contains your logos. It contains kind of the header for the standalone version, all the colors throughout the console, different icons or options for buttons and shapes and form fields, all that sort of stuff. It also has your system-wide font. So this is a good thing also to get your eyes on if you want to make changes to the way the system looks visually, either to make it match your website better or kind of align with your branding. All right, and then the last component of this is also kind of a greater conversation, but you can also think about how does Service fit into your website in terms of web integration. Now there's a lot of choices in how Service is integrated into your website. We have an article about integrating Service into your website, and we also offer a free web integration meeting. If you would like to take advantage of that, please let us know and we can set something up. But just thinking about, how is Service integrated into your website? How do things look? How are we recruiting volunteers? If it's not something you've put some thought into, maybe now is a good time to do so. So we do also have a webinar on that subject as it regards to kind of recruiting or streamlining your volunteer registrations. So this can be a useful tool in sort of understanding, what are some best practices? How are we directing people? And then, like I mentioned, we also offer that web integration meeting. All right, well, we've covered quite a large topic today as it regards to updating your database and making sure that things are kind of cleaned up and ready for the new year. Of course, as you have more questions as it relates to this, please don't hesitate to reach out to our customer support team. You can always do that using the Need Help button at the bottom of the page. You can type in a topic or a question here, and you'll see articles that have to do with that. But you can also always click Contact Us and submit a ticket, especially if you have questions about, how do I get rid of this or how do I update that information? If you're nervous about making bulk updates or, anonymizing a profile or doing things like that, please ask first. We are always happy to help, and they will get back with you right away. So thanks for your time today. That is it for kind of this refreshing database portion of our webinar.